Welcome back to the Regenerative Health Podcast. Tonight I'm joined with two of the world's leading experts on indoor lighting and human health. I'm joined by Scott Zimmerman. Now, he's an optics engineer. He's an expert in light-life interactions, particularly with regard to the infrared spectrum. He is the author of the groundbreaking paper Melatonin and the Optics of the Human Body, and he's the founder and chief engineer of Naira, who are putting back infrared into indoor lighting settings with their special bulb technology, and also by Andrew LaTour. Now, Andrew is originally a chemical engineer by training. He's a photobiomodulation expert. He's the founder and chief engineer of Gemba Red, who are making photobiomodulation panels and some indoor lighting bulbs as well. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Now, the topics of tonight's discussion are very, very long, and I think we're going to pick up on some fascinating threads that we've talked about individually in our previous episodes. And for the listeners, they can go back and check out both of those previous episodes that I've done with each of you. But maybe let's start with what's changed. And since we last talked, Scott, you offered some pretty exciting points about what has changed since the election over in the United States. So please just give us a quick preview of what you off air mentioned that you've been working on.
Well, I mean, with RFK Jr. coming into the mix and Trump, we're trying very hard to push back on. Biden's group did a last minute push for rule change where they increased the minimum lumens per watt to 120, which basically negates any ability to do not only what we do in the near infrared supplying, or any of the circadian, non-circadian. And so that, to me, it was at 45 lumens per watt, which I could still put 3 times the amount of near infrared to visible into a light bulb and sell it. And then, so Martin Moretti and myself and David Keating are trying to put in a petition that's to basically negate or revoke the rule change. I'm also trying to go through Doge and see whether or not we can basically shut down the Department of Energy efforts in the area of lighting. Yes, that is a stretch, but the reality is that LEDs, if you believe what I believe, LEDs are one of the biggest disasters we've had in lighting. We basically threw away 90% of the spectrum, and we're seeing everything from, why you're sitting in red light, because you feel that it helps you, and then we've got people wearing blue blockers because the blue is now dangerous, yet I can walk outside for 100 years under a blue sky and be perfectly fine. So it's like we've developed this toxic light source, and the public, in my opinion, is reacting by blocking blue and increasing the amount of red, trying to get back to something that's more natural, or at least the right stimulus to the body at the right times of day. So, I believe that the DOE put I know the DOE put millions and millions of dollars into LED lighting, and their charter was they were supposed to bring it to the U.S. Well, they didn't bring it to the U.S. They shipped it over to China because every one of the companies that got money from the DOE have now basically transferred their technology to China. So it is, in my opinion, one of the biggest disasters a perfect example of why government shouldn't be involved in certain technology developments. Provide money to the groups out there, the small companies or whatever, but don't start mandating things, because they're negatively impacting not only our health, but they're also financially hitting us across the. We are at this point are the only screw-based bulb manufacturer in the U.S. and that's so it hurts us especially. for what we're trying to do and what I believe needs to happen to lighting to make it safe again. So,
Yeah, very interesting points. And Andrew, what are your takes on these points?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we need excessive government intervention. If LEDs are to be proven superior, then it's more about having the quality control, making them good quality, educating the public, and if they fail to do that, then people should have the choice to choose whatever lighting they want, incandescents or other alternatives. Should be part of the marketplace. Scott's got a very unique, bulb design that's kind of a hybrid LED and incandescent. So why would you stifle innovation that way? So yeah, that's interesting, and then we'll see if we're getting, some sort of new tariffs on, are they going to cover it on, electronics or LEDs? And then that could encourage some more, bringing, manufacturing back to the U.S. Cause, if you have a lot of tariffs that could help motivate companies to bring stuff in. The tariffs didn't affect my business last time Trump was in office, so I'm not sure. Maybe the LEDs were excluded that time, but we'll see. So there's different economic ways that we got to bring manufacturing in house. We got to do more, more research here in the States, and release a lot of the regulations so that way we can have real competition and real innovation and see what comes out on top.
Yeah. And the fascinating, I guess, reason that I wanted to get you two both together was that I think both of you are attacking this problem of near infrared deficiency in indoor environments from two different angles. So maybe Andrew, you could start by again just previewing you the problem and then your strategy for attacking what this near infrared starvation is in indoor environments.
Yeah, I mean, like Scott said, people have started to feel a change, over the past couple decades of, why is our health deteriorating? Why is our sleep poor? Why do we have less energy? And, that all could be related to, the mismatch between our indoor lighting, our indoor lifestyle, and, what we're supposed to experience, outdoors and sunlight and things like that. And so, we have a huge proportion of the sunlight spectrum in red and near infrared and mid infrared as well. And when we live indoors, we're not getting so much of that. We used to have incandescent bulbs. We used to have fireplaces and different techniques that would give us a little bit of that indoor infrared radiation. But obviously we've gotten rid of that with fluorescent bulbs and LED bulbs. And so that's, how I got started with red light therapy was I was using incandescent heat lamps therapeutically for, my back pain. And then I got into LEDs and, you can make specific LEDs with the red and the near infrared wavelengths and you use it at sufficient power. So, those have become great stand-ins to help, bridge the gap of like, hey, we can use this stuff therapeutically. And now, is there a way we can incorporate it back into our environment as like an ambient kind of near infrared that used to come from, incandescent bulbs.
Yeah, and that's a really good point to emphasize the semantics and definitions, which is the LED technology isn't in and of itself a bad thing. I think everyone's clear on that. Us three are clear on that. But the point that that I'm pushing back on and we're pushing back on is that the mandating of cool white energy saving LED in ambient lighting. And as you made the point, Andrew, you can make an LED to emit non-visible 850 nanometer near infrared light that isn't even, as I said, visible. But it's all about the technology that we're using, and you can use this technology for good, not for evil.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, and number one, Andrew, thank you for helping with some of the measurements you've been doing on some of our bulbs. I appreciate that a bunch, and your feedback on it. I see them as very complementary things. It's kind of like comparing, getting a charge your Tesla or have a trickle charger, type thing. That's what I look at it as the situation. We tend to be trying to prevent, I guess I'd say our approach is that we're trying to match as much of the solar spectrum as we can, clear out the beyond 3,000 nanometers, because I believe that the body has adapted to take advantage of all those different wavelengths. And, our goal is to match it up as close as we can so that we can get a better or stimulate all the different parts of the body's responses to the solar spectrum. And I don't see that there's really a conflict between one versus the other. They just, you look at some of the work that Glenn did, if you look at sunlight in the region of the near infrared, you've got 200 milliwatts per centimeter squared available in that 650 to 1100 nanometer range. And yet you see Glenn Jeffries taking some 670 and showing a huge change in glucose levels, using only about 28 kilojoules, compared to, something that could be as much as during a day can be as much as 30 megajoules from sunlight, or at least 15 megajoules in that region. So, the body is, I think there's wavelength and spectrum, but there's also dose, and dose is surprisingly, it doesn't take much to cause a change. And then, of course, if you also look at Glenn's other work, it continues on, can have a lasting effect for 3 or 4 days, which I think makes total sense logically, because you get somebody, you can't guarantee, the body can't guarantee there's going to be a sunny day every day, so it has to have some capacity to hang on for a while, or the body operate in a different, higher state for a while after you do a therapy session. And all we're trying to do is not degrade it by putting a bunch of blue lights in there that cause, without the near infrared, that kind of degrades discharges the battery, I guess is what you'd say. So I think it's very interesting, the combination and where we're going with it. But
yeah, and some of the terms you mentioned, you talked about like the total joules of those treatments, and that's a very key aspect that a lot of people don't get the education on dosing with red light therapy. Is like, if you take your joules per centimeter squared and you kind of multiply it by your coverage area, that's your total joules. And, guys like you, and I hear Dr. Hamblin mention using that term a lot. So I think, the public hasn't gotten a lot of education on that aspect of looking at total joules. Like, in parallel, that study was 40 milliwatts per centimeter squared for 15 minutes on the backs, covering, most of the entire back of the patients. And then they did the blood glucose test like 45 minutes afterwards, because they know it's like a delayed response. So the other interesting point is that, Glenn, I heard in another podcast, was saying it's like flipping a switch, and then you get this cascade of effects. And I think that's another important way, people are kind of thinking of like, oh, I'm getting light right now and it's charging my battery and it's producing ATP in real time. But actually the peak of ATP production is often 3 to 6 hours after the treatment has ended. And then, like you said, it lasts for, 2 or 3 days. There's kind of a peak, at 3 to 6 hours, and then it goes back down, over a couple days. So it's very interesting that, we need to think of it more as flipping a switch and giving us a stimulus, as opposed to like, oh, I need to, get tons of joules and tons of intensity, and it's only happening in real time while I'm getting the treatment. But you have to have patience with red light therapy. A lot of the effects happen, a little bit later on. A couple hours is where you peak. So that might be why, he talks about doing it in the mornings, and then, you get the rest of the day to get those benefits. And your other point is really key, because I get comments about this all the time of, the levels that we use for red light therapy, the intensity, the joules, all this stuff is significantly less than getting sunlight for 30 minutes. The intensity of, 40 milliwatts per centimeter squared, maybe the total solar spectrum is up around 100 or more. So we're getting less intensity from, red light therapy devices used in clinical studies, and you're getting less, joules per centimeter squared and all this stuff. So it's very hard to convince people, because I hear the rhetorical argument all the time. I'm like, oh, well, sunlight, you get a lot of joules, and sunlight, you get a lot of intensity and heat and warmth. And that's not, kind of contextually the same thing, because photobiomodulation often uses a lot lower, intensities and doses than sunlight. So you have to kind of treat them almost as separate entities of, maybe there's something special about using wavelengths in isolation without the blue light from the sun, or, getting a certain stimulatory response that's mimicking, the sunrise or the sunset, because that's proportionally more red and near infrared without, as much UV and blue. So it's, definitely a big fallacy that I've got to try to push against, of like, we have to appreciate we're using less, parameters in sunlight, yet we're still getting responses that's very, paradoxical to a lot of people.
Yeah, well, a couple things in there. One of my pet peeves is that I'm not against circadian. I'm just not 100% buying that you can do anything with it in the visible only, and mainly it's because of nature. Because I keep on saying I love blue sunsets, because the reality is that if you look around you and you think of yourself as a solar collector, the majority of what you're exposed to is blue in a sunset. It's behind you, it's on the side of you, it's all around you, and you see this little flash of orange and red for about 10 or 15 minutes, but then in top of all that is a huge amount of near infrared that's thrown into the mix. So, sometimes I think that one of the things that the photobiomodulation people are struggling with is that everybody says that, oh, we already understand everything, it's all circadian. Well, circadian is not well defined yet. And I think if you go to some of the researchers, but unfortunately, it tends to block people looking at photobiomodulation, our light sources and all that. Oh, there's already a solution. We're going to just shift it from blue down to orange, and, that's perfect. And that's not true. I mean, circadian flops when you try and just use visible, is what my belief is. And it also gets in the way of, I don't know how about you, Andrew, but with me, one of the things I run into is, oh, we already understand that it's just circadian. It's not a problem. We already got it all figured out. All you have to do is tune the LEDs from blue to orange, and that's good enough. It doesn't work. I mean, if you talk to people that are in the lighting industry, circadian has been a major flop for the industry, because they're trying to do something in 400 nanometers when in reality sunlight is over 3,000, 4,000 nanometers of spectral content. So you can't really do what nature does from a circadian standpoint just using visible only light. And that's what our position is. But I do get frustrated when things get, people get into their head a certain thing and you can't get away from it. So.
But yeah, you're talking about circadian as terms of, sleep cycles and, hormonal cycles that follow the circadian rhythm. And, it's a very powerful stimulus of the blue light aspect, during the day, the blue light, they say, okay, that shuts down your melatonin production, makes you awake, makes you alert. I'm using some green lights now because it's a little bit safer than blue, and it's helping me, early in the morning here. But like you're trying to tell them, hey, tell the architects, tell the people building buildings, telling the people installing the lighting in buildings, all they want to do is modulate the ratios of the visible spectrum, but they're not really considering adding back in any invisible near infrared. I saw like some weird studies during COVID of like, oh, they want to introduce some UV into, standard lighting, a little bit of UV that helps, sanitize the air from germs and bacteria, without trying to, alter the light. But now we need to consider, the effects of near infrared. There was one study that they modified like a IKEA, LED lamp with some 850 nanometers LEDs. I don't think it had a significant effect, but it was kind of a step in the right direction. And they were talking about this topic of like, hey, we're going to try to, DIY some near infrared back into a standard LED and see, start to monitor how people feel and if they get better sleep and whatnot. So I think that those kind of studies are starting to take the steps in the right direction to say, hey, where are we going to get more near infrared? Do we need to incorporate it back into standard lighting? Or, I just say, hey, get some, infrared floodlights that they use for security cameras, or get, if you can still find incandescent bulbs or, your bulbs, and get that near infrared, because maybe it's got the melatonin, maybe it's got some, non-visual signals for our sleep cycle. And so, the best they can do is offer, we're going to change the ratio of blue to red, for your corrected color temperature. Usually you have like 2700 Kelvin as that like nice warm, white, that a lot of people like. That's kind of similar to what incandescent bulbs would make. And so we use the spectrum of the LED just to mimic that, and it doesn't really give you the infrared.
Yeah, and the other problem is that I've been looking at melatonin for a lot of years, and we published that paper where we showed that based on the work from Theron, that melatonin, I can actually increase melatonin at 9 a.m. in the morning simply by doing exercise, if you measure it properly. What he did, and what I think is so exciting coming forward now, is we're starting to get all these different biosensors where you can actually measure melatonin and cortisol levels in real time, with 3-minute sampling frequencies. But what Theron showed clearly is that 9 a.m. in the morning, if you start doing a bunch of exercise, melatonin and cortisol both go up to levels that are higher than what you have at night in the blood plasma.
Wow.
So our understanding, there is clearly a wish list by the body to do the cortisol melatonin dance back and forth to get us to sleep better. But it also, melatonin is being generated during the day, whenever you do anything. And so, based on that data, we really need to start rethinking what the circadian's doing, because like I say, I mean, you get 200 picograms per milliliter in the blood just by doing exercise during the day.
Because it's,
if you measure.
Kind of a stimulus, or because it's based on mitochondrial efficiency, because the mitochondria is regulating the
what it
melatonin
appears
production.
to be is the mitochondria. There is the pineal-based melatonin,
Yeah.
which is there because at night our brain is running at 80% efficiency, and you have a boost there to kind of get you through the night. But during the day, every mitochondria is capable of generating melatonin. So all your cells are generating melatonin you think about the capacity that provides to the body. Melatonin is the best antioxidant that we know of. So when you're starting to do a bunch of exercise, once you get to a certain level there, you can actually measure the change in the blood during the exercise. And then about within 15 to 30 minutes, it drops back down to baseline after you do it. So there's a transient, and then there is this basic, like I say, I don't disagree that there is a cortisol spike and a cortisol rise and a melatonin rise as a function of time, but that's actually the smaller part of the melatonin. We generate much more melatonin in the body just doing things than we are from the circadian response. So
A couple points, Scott, and I want to really make this clear for the listeners. And in terms of, I really do agree with you what you're saying about how the circadian focus of indoor lighting has left a lot to be desired. And as you've mentioned, you both mentioned that if we just play with the visible spectrum, and you mentioned Dr. Martin Moeed, his company just reduces the spike of blue light in that 480 range and moves it into the violet. And therefore, you're still building a light that looks white and allows illumination to do occupational tasks, but it doesn't stimulate the melanopsin receptors in the eyes and skin as much. So people are reporting better sleep and reporting less shift work related adverse effects. But I 100% agree with you, which is that visible light is still only whatever 40% of the total solar or less irradiance that we're getting on during the day. So obviously during the daytime we need to build in more wavelengths of light, and that's when Naira bulbs coming in, and that's what a lot of this conversation is about. When you bring up the melatonin sites of synthesis, I think this is a really key point. And you're saying for the listeners who are following along that the amount of melatonin that our body is making during the day on site in our mitochondria is essentially dwarfing the amount that gets released from the pineal gland into the circulation upon sleeping. If we're only thinking in absolute terms, then yes, it kind of minimizes the significance of the circadian pineal melatonin. But from my point of view, the the absence of light at night and is the critical point, and with regard to the circadian function, because that is when the apoptosis and autophagy and mitophagy is happening. So on one level, yes, we can diminish the role of the circadian rhythm, but all the evidence is a lot of evidence is pointing towards when we light up the night. And Martin already talked about that with regard to breast cancer. Then you start messing with these cellular garbage cleaning mechanisms, and insulin resistance, all the mitochondrial related chronic diseases and cancer. They spike.
Yeah, I guess the one thing I'd make a point is I agree with you totally, but my opinion is that dimming range is more important than spectral shift, because there's such a huge difference between direct sunlight and nighttime, and we've taken away nighttime by putting in all these artificial lights that blue happens to be probably the worst, but part of it, but just the fact that we can't get to dark anymore makes it very difficult for, in my opinion. And it's really a function, and that's why I designed the bulb like I did, is that we were trying to get the dimming range, because people aren't aware of this, but the old incandescents dim beautifully. They would go down to a nice orange glow. It's very romantic, type situation. And, so that's what we do. We basically turn all the LEDs off in the bulb and when you get down into the lower dimming range and just go with straight incandescent. You know, you're not using much power anyway. You're just trying to make a nice warm glow. And so I think that one of the things that LEDs did, they're really difficult to dim well. And they sure don't dim into infrared. They dim into kind of a blue-white in a lot of cases, unless you've got a whole bunch of different LEDs in there. So I think that your point about dimming range is one of the key aspects. I mean, I think you dim the bulb, if you can dim the bulb down low enough, that spectrum is almost irrelevant at some level, but that's not what's available in the market. If they're lucky, if they can do a 100 to 1 or 1,000 to 1 compared to a million or 10 million to 1 that we get from nature. So I think we're all kind of taking away a tool that people used to have. Not only was incandescent mostly infrared, it also could be dimmed down to some beautiful orange glows that are reminiscent of a fire or something like that, or a candlelight. So there's practical, and then there's technical as well, I guess is what I'd say.
Yeah, and it's really
go on, Andrew.
It's really a double whammy, because we need bright lights during the day. Sunlight's like 10,000 lux, and if you get bright lights during the day, especially in the morning or noontime, you get better sleep at night. And if you get bright light exposure during the day, you're actually more resilient to blue lights and lights at night. And that helps with your sleep latency and helps you fall asleep faster. So it's kind of a double whammy. If we're living an indoor lifestyle with less than 500 lux, on indoor building lighting is less than 500, often less than 300 lux, then you're not really getting any close. The bright light therapy uses at least a couple thousand lux. And then you get into the nighttime, and you're going to be more sensitive to that light at night because you didn't prime yourself with bright lights during the day. And, that's where, like you said, the blue blockers help reduce that blue spectrum, or using red lights at night or using orange lights. That's shifting the spectrum, focusing on the spectrum. But if you have too much brightness, regardless of the wavelength, that's, it can still keep you up. I can put a blue filter on my TV screen, put a red filter on my TV screen and watch TV all night. It's not going to make me fall asleep. So, you're still getting that bright light. So that's what your point is. Like, you can, get by, because some people kind of get off put by red lights. It's kind of weird and spooky to use, monochrome red light at night. You can get by with, an amber or, a very warm white, as long as you can dim it down low enough. You probably want to dim it as low as you can function and not, stumble around your house. But dimming is also an important aspect. And just, the red light bulbs I sell and the red light bulbs I recommend are just naturally super dim, just because red, doesn't really have a big, strong, lumens to, the wavelength, because it's lower on our spectral sensitivity. So you can get by with reducing the brightness. And again, you don't want to blast yourself with bright red lights at night, just as much as blue lights.
Yeah. To me, like I say, I think the dimming range is a critical aspect. We try and do, with our DC bulb, you can drop it down to 100,000 to 1 type thing, is just by changing the voltage on the device. And I think that's really
Sorry,
important.
clarify that ratio, Scott. Clarify the ratio for the listener. What ratio are you referring to?
The lumens at versus at full brightness versus dimmed down. The way the bulb's designed is it basically has both the incandescent and the LED on at full brightness. And then as you adjust the voltage, it comes down and the LEDs turn off. And it actually has a slightly longer, broader dimming range than an incandescent by itself, because you've got the high efficiency of the LED at the top end to kind of drive that, lets you get a little more extension on the dimming range. Now that means that people have to think about dimming in a different way. The AC bulb that, like I say, Andrew was nice enough to help me with a little bit. It works on a standard phase dimmer, but once you start doing those kinds of things, then flicker and those things come into play, which can be adversely affecting people as well. So that's why with the new ones that I sent to Andrew, that we're trying, I think you got like 3% at the peak.
Yeah.
Yeah, we
Much
tried to
lower,
really knock it down. I still prefer the DC just because I'm a purist. But the reality is that people wanted an AC, so we made an AC version. But so much of what we're going on is kind of a double whammy. You have all the spectral issues where we shrunk that, and then you've got all this pulsing going on with thousands of hertz, and that I don't think are good and unnecessary. But I think the biggest thing for me is that I think the public is really trying to show everybody in the industry what it wants. You're doing blue blockers because the blue to red ratio is out of whack with the source. You're seeing people do red light therapy and seeing positive results. That's all in sunlight. And and one of the things with working with Glenn, I mean, he's doing great things, and but every time you turn around, there's another new biomarker. The glucose test. Now he's showing that color contrast is degraded if you compare between incandescent versus LEDs. So you've got all these different biomarkers. People are, increasing the wound healing rates. They're finding that there's a benefit for anxiety. They're finding that it actually stimulates various immune responses. So, and what do we keep coming back to? The body is taking advantage of 250 nanometers out to beyond 4,000. And if we don't provide that, then there is some degradation to our ability to survive. So,
yeah, great points. And I'm going to definitely transition us to the criteria of optimal lighting. And you mentioned dimming range and spectrum as two critical ones. I want to I want to circle quickly back to the role of the circadian rhythm, and we talked about, and in your papers, Scott, you've talked about human beings as essentially photon collecting organisms. We're photon harvesters, and there's good your work showed that we're photon harvesters in the near infrared, and concentrating them in the amniotic fluid and the cerebrospinal fluid and the grooves of the brain. And what I think a point I want to make about the circadian stuff is that the distribution and the occurrence of non-visual photoreceptors like melanopsin and like neuropsin in the skin, in the blood vessels, in the subcutaneous fat points to me that we're also a blue light collecting device, and we're exquisitely sensitive to blue light during the day. The body is constantly trying to collect as much light information through these visible photons as well as the non visible near infrared photons. So the reason why I bring that up is because I think that has significance for circadian suppression of melatonin secretion, and I have no idea how this is playing out in a kind of regulatory point of view, but I think to minimize the significance of circadian melatonin on a purely basis of its less on an absolute terms in terms of production, I think that's not necessarily going to be the correct way to look at it because of the way that the body is also optimizing for collecting blue light information during the day. And that will transition into the point that I'll quickly make, and I'll get you guys to comment on what I've just said, is that for me, when the sun goes down, there should be zero, the minimum amount of light that you need to do what you need to do. And that to me looks like a small dose of visible red, which is not melanopically active.
I'll let you go, Andrew.
Oh, all right. Well, yeah, I'm full on. If we've got these non-visual receptors both in our eyes and in our skin, then again we're collecting that light information during the day. You go to the beach and you get a lot of sun, even if you're wearing sunglasses or you're under a parasol or whatever, which you're not supposed to do, but even in the worst case scenario, you're getting all that light information into your skin and you sleep really great, those days. So, having as much skin in the game as I'll borrow from Jack Cruz, if you have as much skin in the game as possible, you sleep very well. I sleep very well when I even use a far infrared sauna and I get all that light energy into my body. So maybe, we're not even that discriminatory of blue light or infrareds and reds. It seems like we just want to collect as much light information as possible, and, our body will figure out, how to utilize it. So the shorter wavelengths they don't penetrate as much and they are more photochemically active. So I think, hopefully we'll find more, like we found with UV, has a lot of, bioactive roles and vitamin D production. I think we'll find more roles that blue light is playing with some of these opsins and some of these receptors in our skin.
Yeah, and if you look at the melanopsin and you look at its spectral response, it runs clear out to 650 nanometers. I mean, your point that you were making about green, the late Ian Ashdown wrote a paper before he died where he was showing that if you really believe the circadian action spectrum, it's the green that's actually more important than the cyan, because
Yeah.
because the spectrum, the action spectrum assumes a uniform intensity that you're in, but sunlight is actually peaking up in the green, so it's actually the green portion of the melanopsin response that where most of the energy is actually being localized. And so, to your case where you're finding that there's some benefit to put green in, it's because, well, it's affecting the melanopsin in a way that even more than the cyans are. But to me, the basic concept that we need to get through is to everybody is the body is a solar collector, and it depends on that energy to do things that you can't do just by eating some kind of a steak or a potato. The it is a true it is the largest energy input into the body when you're outdoors. And from what I believe, based on the data we've gotten from some of the melatonin data, is that when you go out to the beach and you sit there on the beach, you're basically building up this response of melatonin from all your cells. And then when you leave the beach, all of a sudden that drops and you get a kind of there's a kind of a hangover, a little bit of excess melatonin. You have that kind of, why am I sleepy when I come home from the beach? Why am I sleepy when I do an exercise? Why am I sleepy when I do a cold water immersion right afterwards? Because you're kicking up the hormonal response within the body, and the body appears to always be generating an excess of melatonin because it is such a good antioxidant. And that tail off is what you feel when you're feeling that kind of sleepiness, it's a sensation during the middle of the day. And again, don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking circadian that it's there. I'm just saying it's more of a wish list than a should be determining everything we do in our life type thing, which some people like to assign. So that's just my opinion. But
Yeah, no, the point is very well taken. And the other point is, again, to frame it for people, from the point we've evolved, from dawn till dusk, humans were irradiated with this massive amount of solar energy. And speaking to you both is really helping people to conceptualize how much energy truly we were being irradiated naked. Like, let's be clear here, we were naked, being fully irradiated with UV light from the moment it showed up to the moment it disappeared, and it was balanced with all this other non-visible near infrared and visible light. And this is a really important point for people to realize when, especially when I'm talking about the sun here in Australia and pushing back against narratives from, say, the dermatology profession, and the fact that their view is so extremist in the anti-UV camp, and it's so isolated and reductionist. So I think really framing for people that you had a massive amount of solar exposure throughout your ancestral past. And yes, that UV light varied, and it varied based on your ancestry and your skin type. So let's just take that into account rather than, hiding in a cave and taking vitamin D pills, which is the joke that Professor Richard Weller always uses for what his colleagues pass as sunlight advice these days.
yeah, I mean, to me, that was one of the things I got in trouble for was is that I kept on saying that, if you look at it just from the optic standpoint, um, the 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 highest density of photons in the body, in the skin, is actually in the far infrared, the short wave infrared, because there's such a strong absorption. And that is being basically appears to be being used by the body to generate hydrogen peroxide, which is then used, it's in the outer 50 microns of the skin. And that hydrogen peroxide allows us to basically photo bleach the outer portion of the skin to get a higher efficiency for UVB absorption, which then allows you to make cortisol, vitamin D, sex hormones, and all these things. So I think the main thing I keep on trying to say is don't discount even small areas of energy coming from the sun, because it may be doing something very unique in combination with other wavelengths. And that's one of the reductionist problems. And Glenn's been really good about this and making these points is that, unfortunately, we tend to run reductionist type experiments where we look at one wavelength or one biomarker, and the body is having to do this all simultaneously, where it's thousands of different variables going on, and it's optimized as best it could in sunlight to get the best results we can for survival. When you start talking about one wavelength or one biomarker, you end up basically missing the fact that you may be hurting something else. And one of the things that I got in trouble for was I kept on saying to the sunscreen people, the cosmetic people, what you're doing for someone who has very light skin may be helpful. I don't believe it, but it may be helpful. But mandating that to everybody, all the cosmetics to have SPF in them, hurts someone with dark skin, especially dark, at higher latitudes, they're struggling to make vitamin D as it is, and you're putting SPF on someone with very dark skin that has almost zero chance of getting melanoma, and and putting them at a disadvantage, in my opinion, compared to someone with lighter skin. So it's a very complicated arrangement. The relationship between sunlight and biology. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you also mentioned in your work in previous episodes about the essential design of the dermis and I believe it was the dermis and epidermis junction, and optically, you mentioned that it looks like a essentially a solar concentrating device. Is that what you said? Have I quoted you correctly?
well, I mean, one of the things that I'm just really excited about is we're starting to do a lot more work in the area of looking at the periodic structures in the body. The body has got this innate ability and amazing ability to generate these periodic structures. If you look at your cones or rods, they've got all these little platelets all arranged, and those optically allow for concentration of certain wavelengths and reflection of other wavelengths. So it gives you some selectivity. And, that's what I think is just so exciting about what we're seeing with some of these models now. It's almost that the body's been doing this for millions of years, and we're just barely able to model it even now with some of the telecom stuff going on where they use periodic structures. And, in this outer part of the skin, it's just absolutely amazing where the structure that we have between the epidermis and dermis, the texturing, we do exactly the same texturing on solar cells to enhance their ability to collect light from all directions. So the is way ahead of us as far as all the optical things that are going on within it. And, we're we're just slowly getting to the point we can even, like I say, model some of the effects. And I think that if I have an argument with Jack Cruz, it's that I think he's underestimated or hasn't looked at the optics of the body enough, because he's way up here above me on any of this other stuff. But on that part of it, I think he's underestimated the importance of what the body is capable of doing to enhance its ability to survive and stuff. We can't all move to El Salvador. Put everybody in El Salvador, we're going to be in trouble.
Right.
But
Or was it Florida or the Yucatan Peninsula, or what's it today?
yeah, I mean, like I say, I mean, the the body's has evolved the ability to adapt to a large range of environments, and where it hasn't been able to adapt to is that this indoor environment, artificial environment that we've created, and the foods that we're now eating, all those things are putting us in a hole, and making it harder and harder for the body to and it's the environmentally, the aspect, the benefits that we could maybe gaining by understanding and controlling the environment we're in are huge. I mean, what was it? 99.9% of all COVID infections occurred indoors, in our homes. Why? That tells you that being outdoors is doing something different. And it's not just the UV, it's the other things as well. And so, but my hope is that we'll start to get a little bit smarter about understanding some of these structures and what they're doing in the body, because it allows the body to kind of almost not disobey the second law of thermodynamics, but really optimize efficiencies. And that's what you're seeing in Glenn's work. He's putting some photons in at 28 kilojoules into the back of the 10% of the body, and he's dramatically changing the systemic response of glucose. I mean,
Yeah, I just reviewed a paper the other day that just came out on, they were using red light therapy, 670 nanometers on the backs of mice that had diabetic retinopathy. They covered their eyes and covered their heads, so they got no direct exposure to the eyes, but they found that their retinas, significantly improved their health. They did, 20 weeks of daily exposure just on the backs of the mice, and their eye health got significantly better. So it's all these systemic effects, and they put it on stem cell mobilization from bone marrow. So they were monitoring some of those biomarkers about stem cell release.
Yeah, I mean, we need to start thinking in terms of two different things. There's the the radiative input, and then in more the thermodynamic characteristics of the body. I mean, we can survive in the dark. We can eat stuff. We can do whatever. We don't like it very well. It makes us really grouchy and a bunch of other things, but we can survive,
Right.
but the minute you put sunlight into the equation, the one thing that and I don't know if we put it up or not, but I think one of the problems is that we've been focused on thinking about light in the wrong way. Terms matter. And if you look at a standard solar spectrum, it looks like all that matters is the invisible. But if you actually look at it in terms of electron volts, which is what actually happens in the body, where you're trying to get one electron to do some kind of an electron to go someplace, then you find that the near infrared and the shortwave infrared is actually the dominant, part of the solar spectrum, because you have to get it in terms that actually make sense for the body. So, I think we're slowly moving towards getting a better understanding of things, what is actually important to the body, rather than what we ASTM 1.5 decided to put up as the right representation. So
Yeah, the ascorbic effect is what you're referring to, Andrew, is
Yeah.
which you've highlighted in many of your posts and educational videos, which is this idea of treating one part of the body and having a systemic, distant effect in a different part of the body. And if I think back to the history of light and health, that was demonstrated. I believe it was in maybe the 1920s when they worked out that UV light was an effective cure or prevention of rickets. And I can't remember which researcher did it, but he irradiated the forearm of a child with severe vitamin D deficiency, rickets, and noted improvements in bone growth, health, and in the opposite non-exposed arm. So there's this idea that light, not only infrared but also UV, and obviously it was probably through the vitamin D pathway, was having this ascorbic effect. But there's possibly, well, there's who knows how many other mechanisms by which that is occurring. I want to see Glenn's study on diabetics and light done in sunlight. I would like to see what that does, natural sunlight, to people's blood glucose levels in response to the oral glucose tolerance test, because obviously if they're getting the amount of blue light that naturally occurs in sunlight and that's having the opposite effect, potentially raising blood glucose, is what is the net? What are we kind of canceling out? And are we going to have a lowering effect only at sunrise and sunset, and potentially a blood glucose raising effect in midday? I mean, these are all questions that need to be threshed out in my mind.
Yeah, and I think that would be more of a delayed response, because if you're out in sunlight, you're stimulated, you're getting, maybe a blood glucose, increase temporarily, but it's going to help you in the long term. If you're getting consistent sunlight, you're sleeping better, you're being more active, you're being more energetic. So that's more of a longer term thing. But yeah, we can see in the short term, we can use red or near infrared light to, tamp down your blood glucose spikes because your mitochondria is more efficient. But it's one of those things is what's the long-term effects of red light therapy on diabetics? What's the long-term effects of sunlight or broad spectrum on, diabetics? Those would be two different cases. And sometimes, unfortunately, we just look at the short term and the acute, and it's hard to get that longer term perspective.
I think Max brings up a great point. We see something, we say that's positive, but if we don't have it in the context of seeing the other portions, or what else is going on in the body, it may not be positive. It may or not be as important as what we would want to say. As you said, the blue has a negative impact, the red has a positive impact. It's kind of like the whole thing when this started with the myopia. Getting the right ratios of blue to red over the time frame before they turn into a teenager is really critical to define whether or not you're going to have a myopic or a hyperopic situation. And it's I think, pretty straightforward to make the argument that the excess of blue in general has forced us into this myopic type epidemic. And, we need to cut it down. And a great justification. I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't argue with blue blockers if they're in an environment that they need it. You don't need it outside, but you do probably need it in some of these, in sitting there looking at a computer screen all day with no other wavelengths, with a very narrow wave band wavelengths. So
Yeah, and we're going to talk about the different criteria by which we're going to aim for in terms of indoor lighting. But I'll finish off a point about sunlight. Have either of you read the paper by Andrei Slemensky, How UV Light Touches the Brain and Skin? Have either of you heard of that one?
No.
I read some of his work. Yeah.
My major takeaway of that paper was that the skin is actually essentially acting as an endocrine organ, like a fully fledged endocrine organ that is taking light cues and spitting out peptide hormones, POMC cleavage products, endorphins, what you'd expect out of the pituitary gland. So, and hypothalamus. So, yeah, I was wondering if you guys had read that one, had any particular insights into it. But really, that's a paper coming from, Semensky's a dermatologist in the US, more of a clinical point of view. But suffice to say, it's the amount of complexity of light life interaction that is so immense that we have, scratching the surface of, and it tied into the idea. The reason why I brought it up, I remember, was because we're talking about how potentially this POMC peptide, well, pre-pro peptide hormone, is potentially cleaved differentially based on light wavelength, and whatever peptide hormones you get spit out based on potentially what enzymes get activated is dependent on light wavelength, and that might be different throughout the day. So yeah, I don't know if you guys want to comment on that at all.
Well, I've read Slowinski's work a little bit, and it really comes back to this idea that the skin is capable of generating de novo basically all the different cholesterol-based hormones, and doesn't require it to go back. And it just makes sense from a logical standpoint. What are you going to, there are systemic responses and then there are local responses. And if the skin is got to deal with all the different environmental inputs into it, and the idea that it can't locally deal with, I mean, it's like you go to the beach and you sit there and your wife has a swim top on and gets a sunburn. You can see the difference. There's a big difference between where it was under the strap versus where it wasn't. Now, a systemic response to that is of very little use locally, but the ability to actually generate all these different hormones and essentially act like do everything that we see systemically happening locally it just makes logical sense, I think, from what he's shown. And it also then you have to then start thinking about, okay, the amount of surface area and the quantity that can be generated on for the skin is huge. And it's kind of like the whole thing with the mitochondria. All the mitochondria are capable of generating melatonin. They don't have to generate much. There's trillions of them, so it can overwhelm. It can have a very strong impact. And the body has to have the ability, in my opinion, to respond to all kinds of different stressors, in real time locally. And if it doesn't, then there's a real problem. So
Yeah, no, great points. So let's launch back into indoor lighting on that fascinating detour into sunlight and the body's responses. But let's go back to indoor lighting, and a kind of big point in my mind that I felt was ambiguous or needed clearing up in my head and maybe others, is that we talked about, and it's almost looked on fondly in this yesteryear period of everyone using incandescent globes and saying that that was a great thing. But the dosing is something that I'm really unsure about. How much dosing were we getting in terms of near infrared light indoors back in the 1920s? And let's make the historical point that electrification happened in the late 1800s. So, we were potentially lighting up the night from, the 1900s onwards. So can you guys talk about dosing, and how do we know what's an appropriate dose in terms of striving towards adding this light wavelength of near infrared back inside?
You want me to take that one, Andrew?
Yeah, you can start.
Okay. Well, that kind of formed the basis of what I started out when I first met with Hamlin. He was talking about 5 milliwatts per centimeter squared type levels of exposure. And I walked away from that and I said, but wait a minute, if I think that an incandescent bulb is generating 500 lux, you do the math, you end up at 5 milliwatts per centimeter squared of broadband near infrared, not narrowband, broadband. So, an incandescent bulb is providing, similar levels of infrared over a broad wavelength range compared to what he was using with very specific wavelengths. And so, I think that kind of was the moment where I said, well, wait a minute, what's sunlight doing? And you start looking at sunlight and you look at direct sunlight and it's about 1-to-1 at noon, gets down to 3-to-1 in optical watts. So, and then you go into shade and you start seeing the effect of the surroundings on it and all that. So I guess my point is that, an incandescent bulb provides an awful lot of near infrared. And as if you believe, as I do, that you want all the spectral content, then, there's, more than enough in an incandescent bulb to have a similar effect to what we're seeing out of some of the, and that's kind of what's coming out of some of Glenn's new work is that he's starting to compare incandescent to some of these specific wavelengths, and getting some positive results for having other wavelengths. Again, though, he's looking at a single biomarker, and it's hard because there's so many different things that could be going on that we're not aware of. But an incandescent bulb, the nice thing also is that even when fluorescence came along, most people went home to an incandescent lit house. They read a story. They didn't have the TV was small. Now it's huge and makes up most of the light levels that we are exposed to. So there's two sides to look at. There's dosing associated with the positive effect. We also have a much bigger dosing effect from the negative effects of having big screen TVs and LED lighting, just putting out visible only and not getting outdoors and outside in the darkness, or being able to get out in the darkness. So those are kind of my points.
Yeah, and with photobiomodulation, like Dr. Hamlin probably said, there's some sort of threshold of intensity that you need for red or near infrared light to have an effect. So is it 5 milliwatts per centimeter squared? Is it 1 milliwatt per centimeter squared? I've seen one article say, actually reaching your deeper tissues like your brain or your heart, maybe you only need 0.1 milliwatt per centimeter squared, because your skin's blocking so much and hindering the penetration. So, where, it's kind of fuzzy where that threshold is, but they say, okay, if you have some super low intensity, you can expose yourself for hours and hours a day. And even though you can calculate some sort of joules per centimeter squared, the threshold hasn't been met for that stimulus of intensity. So that's kind of the debate, but like you said, we're starting to see more effects from what I would call more like ambient, near infrared and red light. There was some study on rodents that they used, tenths of a milliwatt per centimeter squared, but they kept them there for 12 hours a day. They exposed them for 12 hours a day and got some effect. And like you said, it might feed more into circadian, and signaling and, more of a signaling aspect than it is, photobiomodulation. You get a decent intensity for, 5-10 minutes or whatever, and you get a certain stimulatory response that's acutely observed. It's going to be a lot more subtle if, we're adding incandescent bulbs back in or nearer bulbs. It's going to be, harder to track, again, the long-term chronic use of near infrared in your environment. That's going to be, probably a bit more subtle. So yeah, like if you've got an incandescent bulb in your ceiling that's, 6 feet away, you're only getting like trace amounts of, red and near infrared. You're getting that full spectrum, and it's probably good for your, balanced, spectrum for your eye health and all that. But, I've got a couple incandescent bulbs here pointed at me, but, I'm over 6 feet away from them. So it's the inverse square law. So you're getting less and less intensity with distance. So if you want to use incandescent bulbs, maybe a little bit more therapeutically, then you got to bring them closer to you, or use, a higher power one, like a 250 watt heat lamp, and get that, full spectrum of incandescent, infrared. So that's kind of the juggling point of, what are we going to define this as, like a different kind of class of, ambient, all day long infrared exposure, as opposed to like photobiomodulation, being more of an acute effect. So,
Yeah, well, that's a really critical point, and I was actually talking to Tristan Scott about this recently. To me, photobiomodulation is a therapeutic. There's a therapeutic indication. It's been studied, wavelength specific effects, duration specific effects, obviously dose specific effects. In contrast to having an infrared heat lamp that is providing broadband infrared along a whole range. So, there's the critical distinction of a narrowband LED emitting 5 wavelengths of photobiomodulation light compared to the warm heat lamp throwing light all the way out to, I don't know what, far infrared, I guess it would. And the question I thought was that there's some inhibitory wavelengths going on and in natural sunlight in the infrared spectrum, so that if you're replicating or attempting to replicate natural sunlight with a broadband emitter like a LED heat lamp, infrared incandescent heat lamp, then you're potentially giving the body a inhibitory wavelengths that we wouldn't get in natural sunlight. Can either of you speak to the veracity of that statement?
Yeah, there's a couple studies on saying like around 750 nanometers and 950 nanometers. Those are commonly found as either not having as much of a beneficial response, compared to other wavelengths like the 850s we prefer, or the mid 600s. The 750 and 950 tend to have more of an inhibitory response. Again, if they're using lasers or isolated LEDs, specifically in those wavelengths. And one article, by Dr. I think it's Summer, kind of correlated that with the atmosphere is filtering, certain wavelengths with water and there's a peak of oxygen absorption around 750, and then water absorption has a bunch of ups and downs throughout the near infrared region. So there's one water absorption peak around 950, and then there's another, around 1300. So we do get, so when you get unfiltered incandescent, like from a heat lamp or whatnot, you're getting exposed to more of like what we weren't exposed to throughout evolution. So we might not have mechanisms to either utilize them beneficially, or they might have kind of more artificial effects on our body. So our body, just wasn't built to cope with them. So I saw some interesting articles that they say, to avoid certain wavelengths. But again, that's in isolation. With a laser or LED. If it's part of a broadband emitter, it's probably kind of buffered out, and you're probably not really letting those wavelengths penetrate deep enough to affect any sensitive tissues that would really get that inhibitory response from them. But it is an interesting consideration.
Yeah, this is kind of one of my pet projects from the standpoint of there's a really great study that came out recently from the Guy Foundation by Professor Bell. And when I've been doing the work I've been doing on looking at how, looking at the free radical generation or reactive oxygen species generation as a function of wavelength, what you find is that water in particular had around when you get to the theoretical absorption overtones of water, you saw a increase in the ability of the reactive oxygen species that were being generated at that wavelength. But what Professor Bell did, and one of the key wavelengths was 742 nanometers, and at that particular wavelength, you generate a huge amount of reactive oxygen species. Carew and others have made comments about 750 not being as important, or Hamlin has made that. But what Bell's work is they looked at cancer cells. And what they found is that 734 nanometers, they were using a laser source. They were able to show that, and what the gist is that cancer cells contain more water than healthy cells. So they tend to have a higher level of absorption in the water bands. But what they showed is that exposure to 734 nanometers, which was close to the wavelength that I was looking at, actually caused the cancer cells to die faster than healthy cells and the controls. So again, I think this comes back to the question is you may see effect in one area. And one of the things that, and I don't mean this disrespectful for the PBM people, but there's a lot of motivation to get something to happen in 20 minutes or 30 minutes, you know, and so I have yet to see a paper that really defines, that shows that there's a upper level that you don't want to exceed, but I've yet to see a real paper that showed anything that there's a lower long-term exposure level that you need a particular amount to do something. Usually you need a particular amount to do something so that you can get it done in a reasonable time frame, and you get it. It's kind of like taking an aspirin. You get a real effect, you know, within a certain time frame. And I think that's one of the things with PBM is that they've got a lot of motivation to get things to happen quicker than yeah. If you have a wound on your leg and you go outside and you sit outside, it'll eventually heal, most likely. If you put a PBM and you can accelerate that, I have no doubt you can accelerate that. But, you know, it is not that the other doesn't work. It's that this works faster and better. And I think there's some real positives to PBM because of that. But if that's true, that what Bell is showing, then my goal would be has been to try and develop a light source that basically mimics all those water absorption bands, because you can then localize reactive oxygen species in the cancer cells and hopefully, you know, not going to fix cancer, but you could actually degrade the cancer's ability to spread. And so I think that was one of the coolest papers I've seen in a long time. And I hope that they'll try some of the other wavelengths that are. So if there's you look at the absorption bands in the atmospheric water, if water's the absorber, then the skin, that all it tells you is that any wavelengths in that area are localized on the outer part of the skin, and so I doubt that you know, there really is much of a negative effect associated with those bands that we don't normally see.
And that's what some the papers I had read was about the utilizing those wavelengths, you know, around 750 or 950 for their inhibitory response to combat cancer or combat certain cellular functions that they do want to inhibit. So it's kind of the opposite side of the coin. With red light therapy, you generally want to stimulate cellular proliferation and, you know, all that response. But if you use high intensities, high doses, you know, you get that biphasic response, that inhibitory response. And so they'll utilize the inhibitory response either from certain wavelengths or from high exposures to arrest, cancer growth. That's why they use blue light to, kill the bacteria on the skin that causes acne. So it's purposely utilizing the inhibitory response. So it's not that you should totally avoid these. We can use them for creative kind of therapeutic ways that are different than, what we typically want from PBM is the stimulatory response.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. I mean, it's all about dose, and what you're actually trying to measure is the effect. And
yeah,
like I say, the sunlight's providing it all, and hanging around at a fireplace, around the campfire for 600,000 years. I think we kind of figured out that we kind of like all the different wavelengths. Is what I think.
And Scott, that paper was selective induction of senescence in cancer cells through near-infrared light treatment via mitochondrial modulation. Is that June 24? Is
Yeah, I
that the
think that's
paper?
one.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
Bell
Cat,
was the last author on it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Very interesting
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah, it's just
Mm,
if you it was one of the most interesting things I ever did when I took the data from Zostro and I reformulated it in terms of photons necessary to generate a reactive oxygen species as a function of wavelength. I plotted that out, and all of a sudden, you know, every one of the water overtones showed up in the data. I had no idea. I wasn't expecting it at all. But what it really was showing is that, if you talk to most photochemists, anything shorter than or longer than 480 nanometers can't possibly be doing anything photochemically. Well, here's actual data in human skin showing that every one of the 6 or 7 optical overtones show up in the data as being areas or wavelengths in which the reactive oxygen species generation rate is several times higher than what you'd expect. And I think that's one of the problem that we have right now with biology is that we don't understand what water is doing, especially in a bound state. And it allows things to happen that a lot of the chalkboard guys are sitting there saying can't happen. And so I tend to take some of that with a grain of salt, but
Well, Andrew, you posted a fascinating presentation by Dr. Hamblin on transcranial photobiomodulation and the history of PBM a couple of weeks ago. And I believe in that talk, Dr. Hamblin mentioned that there was this mechanism by which a thermal effect on certain receptors where near infrared and red was being absorbed, affecting the temperature of the water surrounding this receptor and then therefore inducing change. So there's in terms of yes, and as well as ATPase and that interfacial waters potentially is the other mechanism by which that could be near infrared could be affecting mitochondrial function.
Yeah, we have these heat and light gated ion channels that when red or near infrared or probably any wavelength gets absorbed into the cell, it could cause a microscopic temperature increase. Just because it's energy and it gets converted into heat. And that gradient, that it causes will help modulate the ion channels and bring in more calcium or, other effects. And that can start the cycle of ATP production and mitochondrial efficiency. But in photobiomodulation is mostly non-thermal, so it's kind of a microscopic effect. And then, your body has very good thermoregulation. So typically you don't build a measurable temperature increase, but we're resolving that microscopic temperature change. And that's part of the modulation that's happening with red and near infrared light therapy. Like you said, there's the other main mechanism is cytochrome C oxidase that most people know about. And then the other is the nano-clustered water or easy water, the exclusion zone water formation of the layers of water building on, especially on the interstitial part of the mitochondria of building that ordered water that can act as kind of a battery or, provide energy in other ways, or it helps clear out some of the ROS because easy water is very pure. So those are 3 of the main mechanisms of photobiomodulation that we know of so far.
We haven't talked about easy water, but that is something that Pollak's lab has shown, which is that infrared light potentiates this exclusion zone fourth phase property of water. I understand that he's talked about 3000 nanometers as being the most maximally conducive to that effect. Do you guys know anything about that?
What I've read, he usually references, yeah, you want to be above 1000 nanometers. So starting in the near infrared, above that, that seems to be the most optimal, but you still get some easy water from shorter wavelengths. It's, kind of just more the affinity towards it. So everything's kind of more on a spectrum, and there's not a lot of hard lines you can draw. Oh, is 999 doesn't count, but 1000 does, so everything's kind of more on a gradient or a spectrum. So you can build that. And so what easy water needs is a hydrophilic surface and, the right kind of energy, like, infrared light. And then the layers of water will build off of that hydrophilic surface. So a lot of people want to drink easy water or, ingest it. We got this oral fixation of, but a lot of it is like your body is lots of hydrophilic surface, your cells and your, interstitial parts of your cells. So you expose yourself to the light and then your body builds the easy water. And, one of the studies was that they showed like how your blood flow can keep moving without beating heart. So they had some like chicken embryos, they stopped the heart and exposed it to infrared light, and the blood kept going because, the easy water was creating like a layer on the inside of the blood vessels, and that was helping to kind of modulate and push the blood through. So part of, maybe how our blood's being pumped is through infrared and through, some of these mechanisms of easy water formation and, expansion and contraction and, capillary action.
Yeah, that paper was absolutely fascinating, and I actually referenced it in a talk I did right at the beginning of the year in the context of cardiovascular disease, and the implications are profound if we're speaking about an indoor environment that's now deprived of infrared. Because what if even that subtle amount of infrared we were getting from incandescent lights was helping in some way propel venous and arterial blood flow and potentiating the exclusion zone? And when that easy water breaks down, then the likelihood of clotting goes up because of the potential contact of blood contents with the endothelial wall. And from my point of view, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease is a process of thrombosis. It's a thrombogenic process that starts with breakdown of the easy water, and you can see how indoor lighting and the indoor lighting environment, not diet, not cholesterol. Yes, sure, that's the dietary stuff might be playing a role, but from my point of view, I think the breakdown in the ancestry appropriate light environment from a circadian point of view, but probably mostly from a infrared light point of view, that deprivation of that key light is interfering with optimal cardiovascular function, and therefore down the track could be contributing to plaque formation and then eventually plaque rupture and heart attack.
I would bring up the point that, as I said before, in that region, the 2000 to 3000 nanometer, that is the highest density of photons in the body, because what happens is you have a higher number of photons, not the number of watts, but the number of photons that are being produced as a function per watt. And the absorption coefficients are higher than they are actually in the UV. So you get a localization on the outer part of the skin for all those wavelengths. That's why everybody that passed about 1500 nanometers, we all look black with white skin, with white hair, because it's the water that's absorbing everything. So we are very good at absorbing. We're almost a black body absorber at those longer wavelengths. And, that's the thing that I've been kind of focused in on a little bit now, because I believe that those longer, not only is it advantageous to what we do as far as a product, but they're, if you look at the solar spectrum, most people look out to about 1,000 nanometers and then they say there's nothing there. But the reality is that most biological processes are in the half to 1 eV electron volts range, which is in that wavelength range. And you'll see that it is actually, as far as the body's concerned, the peak for useful energy is actually in the 1 to 1.5 micron range, not in the visible, because you look at it in different terms. What matters to the body is that I have sufficient energy to move an electron, and that actually occurs in the far longer wavelengths, not in the visible. Yes, it'll move an electron, but it's what the body does is on a quantum level, according to some work I've read, is that rather than taking a jump of 2 electron volts across a gap, that could take days. But what the body does is a series of multi-hopping jumps, so that reduces the time constant down to millisecond. And so what the body figured out that it's much better off, rather than taking a big jump, it actually does a series of small jumps in the electron transfer chain. And all those tend to be half to 1 eV type levels, which, like I say, even the longer wavelengths have a significant impact on those steps. So.
Yeah. So with EV, that's the electron volts. That's the amount of energy per photon, right? So, we talk about wavelengths, and then that wavelength is literally, how long a wave, how long from one peak to the next peak, a sinusoidal wave. And then you have a corresponding frequency. So usually when we talk about, the spectrums and, lights and whatnot, it's wavelengths, and they always have a corresponding frequency. We don't really talk about, the frequencies as much, but, then you have the electron volts per photon. So generally higher frequencies, the UV, the shorter wavelengths. So you go shorter wavelengths, high frequency, those are higher electron volts, relatively. Right. And then you go to the reds and the infrareds, those are longer wavelengths, lower frequency, and lower energy per photon. So, but you need sufficient, for photochemistry, you need sufficient EVs, electron volts to create some sort of photochemical effect. So, but what your point is that if I have 10 joules of infrared and I have 10 joules of UV, then there's actually a lot more photons in 10 joules of infrared than there is in UV, because the UV is higher energy per photon. So there's less photons in the UV. You're going to get a lot more photons from the infrared. So I don't know. I was just trying to break down the physics,
it's just, to me, it's just interesting that, we started out with watts per meter squared per nanometer. Right. And then the pot guys decided they needed photons per second.
Right. Or photon moles. Yeah,
micromoles of photons per second. And now and that shifted the curve over to where it was a little bit more into the longer wavelengths. But then, like I say, when I started looking at what actually happens on the quantum level, the body has developed this technique, and it's almost fundamental to biology, that if they tried to take and provide that amount of energy, 2 EV, into some of the standard gaps that are in there, it would take days for it to literally quantum tunnel through. But instead, biology uses a series of multi-hops because it's much faster. It's kind of like taking 2 skips rather than trying to do it all in one jump. And it's almost fundamental to the characteristics of biology that they've figured out how to do these multi-hops. And it's part of the electron transfer. The minute you say that is your criteria, have a photon with sufficient energy to affect that change, it shifts the entire spectrum into the longer wavelengths. And and it just physically, when you look at the charts next to each other, you start to see that, how we view things and how we quantify things significantly changes the impression we give, or is more illustrative of what the body is expecting. Body could care less, doesn't know anything about watts. Body doesn't know anything about it does know something about photons per second, but the minute you put it into electron volts, that's that gives it a something that actually is happening biologically into the body. So.
Yeah, and I think that goes into a lot of what I try to teach is like it's much more indirect. There's multiple, you get a photon and that's absorbed. There's multiple steps that's not super apparent. I think, we latched on to the cytochrome C oxidase mechanism that, a photon has to perfectly find this one enzyme, and then the photon, is a homing missile towards that. And then it breaks the, energy bond between nitric oxide, which might be inhibiting, that action, breaks that chain, and then allows oxygen to come in and dock. That's, very improbable to think about all of your photons are going in and homing in on just one enzyme. And so that's why, a lot of it, I think even Dr. Hamlin's saying a lot is water is probably the most common absorber, especially red, near infrared, obviously the longer wave, but there's so much water. So even if the absorption coefficient is low and we get a lot of penetration, eventually the odds are it's going to get absorbed by water and not anything else, because it's going to, every time it encounters a water molecule, it has some, quantum probability of getting absorbed. So eventually, then there's so much water, that's the biggest proportion. So that's most likely. And then the water absorption, it could be micro amounts of temperature change, or modulating heat ion channels, or creating these cascades of effects. So that's where, again, a lot of people want deep penetration and high intensities and all this stuff of like, because they really envision in their head that they're directly stimulating their mitochondria and it's homing in on cytochrome C oxidase. And, they're just kind of getting caught in the weeds of mechanisms that they don't fully understand, and that, the science is still, this is all theoretical stuff. And so it's better, I think Glenn said in one interview that we look at it like a black box. When you have a complex system, if you're just looking at cause and effect, if we shine, light with certain parameters and we get certain biological response, we don't need to know the mechanism that happens in between. It's probably extremely complicated. Right now, we're just in the surface level of like, what's the stimulus we need for our health and how do we get healthy? And we can figure out the mechanisms later. But, looking at it with that black box theory is a very important way of doing it.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with Glenn, but one of the problems we ran into early on is that if you look at the standard models of what goes on with the reactive oxygen species, one of the problems is exactly what you're saying. If I have a reactive oxygen species that has a half-life of a nanosecond, it ain't going very far. So it's got to get converted into something that is real for the body as far as a time constant. And in a lot of cases, a lot of the reactive oxygen species end up being in hydrogen peroxide or bound up in water, something going on with water. So, and then once you do that, then now you've got minutes worth of time constants, so that it actually could, they call it the diffusion, what is it called? The diffuse way, distance or whatever, diffusion distance. So, one of the, like I say, when I was first working with Russ, he was saying, how can all these reactive oxygen species that only last a nanosecond, they can't move more than a few angstroms, let alone all the way across a cell. Right. But if you convert it into something that has got longer time constants like hydrogen peroxide, then you can have these, you call it signaling, I call it having some kind of a reactive response or redox response. And I think that's where one of the most interesting things about it is when you start thinking about it, these time constants and how they influence Biology, the body responds in milliseconds, maybe mostly in minutes, to things. And then if you're just turning some lights on, or you have things that have only last a nanosecond, they're not changing a lot of stuff. So, it's hard to imagine that, they can, you can have a big major effect when all you get is that flash of a nanosecond, and then it's been essentially squelched. So.
Right. And that's kind of the paradox of photobiology, is that you get a burst of ROS, and then that seems to be part of the cascade of, creating a healing response or signaling to the nucleus to, for more cell proliferation. So, there is that temporary burst of ROS, which some people might be afraid of, but that's a key part of what we're doing, of creating that stimulus.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I wanted to draw analogies, and thanks, gents, for really covering a whole bunch of these topics very, in a way that is more understandable. But this idea of weak absorption, I mean, that is exactly what Bob has framed these near infrared light life interactions, which is, yes, they're weakly absorbed, but there's the amount of photons, as you told us, Scott, is enormous, and that when they're getting in there, they're just basically ping-ponging around like a pinball machine until they're weakly absorbed, and then therefore having a biological effect. And really, that, I think what you're saying, to me, it sounds like understanding these light life infrared interactions pushes the focus of photobiology away from the short wavelength UV and visible into the near infrared, and understanding how, giving that the weight of importance that it probably deserves compared to where the focus has been up till now. The other point I'll make about this idea, so electron volts is like just so I can understand, it's the energy per photon. Is that what it is? Yeah.
You
Okay.
can, you can convert it to joules, but it's like a super low joule. So they created a new, term for, it's a very, and it's relevant to, photons and chemical interactions, but it's, thinking about on the scale of like a molecule, or, the energy of electron, or the energy of, a photon. So it's much, but you can convert it to joules. So if you have enough of them, then you can say, okay, I have 10 joules of photons.
Yeah, in the solar industry, or the solar collector, it's pretty prevalent to use electron volts, and it allows you to get to milliamps, or to get to electrons per second, which is what you really care about. And all I'm saying is it's exactly the same solar spectrum as Andrew's saying. You can convert it all back to one thing, but it provides a little different perspective as to what the body is really exposed to. It's a little closer to it. And then the next step will be to take that and move it into 3-dimension, and you start to put the optical absorption characteristics, and then you get electron densities. Because at the end of the day, biology is, as that one Nobel Prize winner and physiologist said, basically a life is an electron trying to find a place to rest. So once we get it into electrons, I think, per second, and the density of electrons for moving away from reactive oxygen species, but into actual electrons moving, then I think we're going to have a much more clearer picture of what the body is interested in.
And those are fundamentally quantum biological effects if we're looking at what's going on at that scale.
It's basic chemistry, too, of like, if you're just thinking about two molecules hanging out, how much EVs, do you need to have them react? So, but, on a macro scale, I just, you mix two chemicals together, you give them some heat, give them, a certain temperature for a certain amount of time, and you get the reaction. So on a macro scale, you just mostly just look at temperature and residence times and things like that. But on the very, micro scale, that's when you start, or molecular scale. So it's not, I wouldn't call it quantum, but it's molecular scale.
Yeah, maybe a better way to put it.
The reason I wanted to make a point just for the listeners is the arrival, I think that the timing of the Cambrian explosion in the evolution of life on Earth was coincided with the change in terrestrial ultraviolet light um, exposure or availability, and the idea that that was potentially instrumental in, I guess, reorganizing, breaking molecular bonds and essentially turbocharging this whole process of the formation of life. So, um, and obviously UV light is able to break bonds. It breaks DNA. DNA is also a chromophore for UV light, which is one that will gets the dermatologist's head spinning. Not that I don't think they've even thought about that, but just as an aside. But it's yeah, it's interesting to reframe the solar spectrum in terms of, yeah, potential photon density and quantity rather than necessarily the electron volts of the different of the wavelengths.
Yeah. Well, and like I say, the other thing that you have to do when you're looking at this stuff is that where the photons are going, and that's what Bob basically shows with his pictures. If you look at most of the literature, everybody defines that it only goes in a millimeter or something like that, and it's just the wrong way to make the measurement. You can't take a scattering volume and define it in terms of penetration depth unless you define also how the light is coming into that volume and measuring it in all directions. And so, you know, that's the one thing that for whatever reason, we still have this hang up about penetration depth when you can take a picture like Bob does and you say, well, it obviously is going at least an inch or two into the body. So,
Yeah.
you know, it may not be at the same intensity level, but, you know, I think that also there's going to be this split coming on where we keep on using the term heat, and heat is not a good term to use for describing what we're trying to figure out because the quality of a photon coming from sunlight is 40 times more than what we have from our ambient in our body, the thermodynamic equilibrium that we have in the body. So, I mean, the minute we bring one of those photons in to the body, it can do a whole lot more than anything you can do just sitting in the dark. And I think that's what's underestimated a lot of times.
Well,
And
it's
unfortunately thrown in.
like the difference between like a heat pad versus like an infrared heat, therapy kind of things of like,
Yeah.
there's, you can heat yourself up pretty easily, with different methods, heat pads and, maybe water. And sometimes you do get a little infrared because everything's emitting infrared from Planck's law. But there's definitely something unique about delivering heat through, far infrared and mid infrared. And, there's some sort of information in those photons in addition to the heat that's being utilized by the skin and the cells.
Yeah, I mean, it's a non-equilibrium thermodynamic problem. And therefore you cannot, most people like to assign a temperature to something. And it's a very oversimplistic view of what's going on because temperature only is valid for black body emitters. It doesn't have any meaning for something like a photon coming in at 670 nanometers. That yet it can generate the same amount of heating. But it is not. You can't assign a color. It's kind of like what we did with the LEDs. We assigned a correlated color temperature but it has no more to do with what a black body. If I take a 3000 Kelvin black body emitter, it follows, as you say, the Planckian law. But we call a 3000K LED 3000K,
right?
But it only operates about 10% of the spectrum that you get from a black body emitter. So, I mean, I think we need to be a little bit more careful on how we use terms. I guess is what I'm really trying to get at here, because if we really want to understand, eventually we have to get down to the point that it is a quantum type approach, where you're looking at, how many electrons, quantum tunneling of electrons, multi-hopping of electrons, all those type of things that are a lot more complicated than just assigning a temperature to it. So.
I had an analogy that came to my mind when you talked about the multi-hopping, and it's when you're climbing a mountain or you're doing a hike, if you try and take a big stride up the mountain, you're really just going to tire yourself out really quickly. But if you take a couple of small steps, then that's a much more energy efficient process of ascending. So sounds like the body's doing that at a very, very micro quantum level to improve efficiency of electron tunneling.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what we want to jump to conclusions or, take a big swing and say, oh, this is definitely what's happening. But it's probably more incremental, multiple steps and multiple stages than, oh, I'm doing a thing with light and this is how it's happening. So it's, many more steps than we're giving ourselves credits for understanding at this point.
Yeah. And I think that Andrew's right about you have to take into account that the photons some cases have to go quite a distance before they're actually absorbed in these low level absorbers that occur in the near infrared component. And so that affects, time constants and build up and a bunch of different things. So, but yeah.
Let's talk about the bulbs quickly. We've done an hour 46, but maybe we'll finish on lighting. Andrew, you gave us a list of, I guess, criteria that you think are relevant for judging light against. And how I think about this is these are the criteria by which we want to, formulate human-friendly lighting. And people should know by now that we think that narrowband blue, cool white LED, energy saving blue LED is the opposite of human friendly lighting. So, yeah, Andrew, take us through a couple of these criteria that you think are important and relevant.
Yeah, I mean, starting with kind of the brightness, a lot of times we talk, people only get the perspective of spectrum and colors and blues and wavelengths. But, you really want to get your home right and your office and whatever, your nighttime environment, focus on the brightness. Like Scott was saying, if you get low enough brightness at night, it doesn't really matter, what color or spectrum it really is. Obviously you don't want pure blue, but, your brightness is a big modulator during the day. You want brighter lights, a comfortable indoor light setting is, 300 to 500 lux. And then you might want to add in some bright light therapy that's a couple thousand lux and do that, 20 or 30 minutes in the morning or, obviously, or just get outside and, get some sunlight and that's, thousands of lux for free. So, get your brightness right. And again, everyone's going to be different with how they do it. And there are like little light meters that are like $100, little cheap lux meters that, can help you kind of figure out relative, but a lot of it's more on feel and your personal, aspect of how much brightness is comfortable for me. How, can I focus? Can I work properly? Am I being interrupted? So, it's a very personal kind of thing. So think about your brightness first. If you're shopping for light bulbs, a lot of times they say the equivalent of an incandescent. So you've got 40 watt equivalent, 60 watt equivalent, 75, 100. So those kind of tell you your expected kind of brightness if you're shopping that way. And then you kind of have to tailor for how big your room is and what you're trying to light up. So yeah, focus on getting the right amount of brightness and then reducing as much brightness as you can, at night before bed. So that's a key thing. And then, we talked about color temperature and, with artificial bulbs, LEDs and fluorescence, it's a color corrected temperature. So it gives you the illusion of, a natural black body emitter that's, an incandescent bulb is 2700 Kelvin. And so that tells you if it's literally burning at 2700 Kelvin and it gives a certain spectrum of what we, appear as white light, but white light can be any gradient of grays or blues or reds. And, so white can be a lot of different things. So you've got this spectrum that we follow that follows tries to mimic the incandescent spectrum, because that feels very natural to us. So 2700 is a very comfortable one. During the day, you might want 3000, 3500, or a little bit more. I probably wouldn't go any more than 4,000. So I think a lot of people have issues if they get a cool white LED and their eyes are burning and they're like, oh my God, I hate LEDs. It's, cause you got something super bright and you got something, that's 5,000 Kelvin. So pay attention to the color temperature, kelvins. And then at night, you want yellows, ambers, oranges, or reds, primarily. So, and you can get by with like a, 2000 Kelvin or 1000 Kelvin too. But yeah, then you want to look at CRI, which is the color rendering index. That's how well each wavelength and color is represented on the spectrum, which incandescents naturally have like 99, and sunlight's like 100. So it's out of 100 LEDs, a generic LED is about 80 CRI. So usually it's lacking in kind of the red part of the spectrum. So the higher CRI, I notice you get a little bit more red as you get higher. So usually a higher quality LED, you can go above 90 CRI, and it's pretty cheap. If you get them around 90 or 93, then they don't cost a ton of money. Then flicker, you want low flicker. We talked about that in previous podcasts, that we get this modulation from our AC cycles. And even if you design, a good rectifier, you get the ripple current, so some of that ripple current tries to get by, and that's what modulates your LEDs and fluorescence, and so you always get a little bit from anything that's plugged into the AC, the ripple will get through, but you can reduce that flicker, and then the magnitude of the flicker is what you can really reduce with, rectifiers and capacitors and, different types of, AC to DC circuitry. So you can get that. So the magnitude, so the frequency is usually set by your AC of your wall. If it's 100 hertz or 120 hertz is usually the frequencies of flicker. So you want the magnitude to be lower, the flicker percent. And then, we talked about EMFs, you get some dirty electricity from LEDs, that's pretty normal. I haven't seen anything too scary from dirty electricity from LEDs. Old LEDs could emit some radio frequency, because when they convert like AC to DC, they emit some RF. But the FCC is tamped down on that because they don't want interference with devices, emitting stray radio frequency. So usually if you get a name brand bulb, then it's not really an issue because the FCC would fine them. So, so that's the quick rundown. And then we talked about a little bit the angle of the light, like in the evenings, and then the night, it's nice to have like table lamps and floor lamps and avoid overhead lighting, just like the angle of the light getting into your eye. And if you've got overhead lights, even if they're red, it kind of throws you off and you think you've got like the sun over your head or something like that. So, and then during the day, it's fine however you want it. I've got a lot of my bulbs pointed more directly at me just so I can get the brightness into my eyes, but it's fine to use overhead lights during the day.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that summary.
Yeah.
So do I get to do my summary?
Yeah, you do. Yeah, good. Tell me. Yeah, you go.
And Scott, this is a great time to explain how the Naira bulb fits against those.
Yeah.
Well, and Andrew's 100% right, and what he's saying, the concept of the Naira bulb is that LEDs are very good at generating visible light in some deeper red light, but incandescents are almost 100% efficient at generating broadband near infrared, because most of the filament, especially when you drop the temperature of the filament a little bit, it's almost all it's why we got rid of them, basically, because they're great at generating near infrared, but they're not that great at generating blues and greens. So what we do is we just do a hybrid where we put the LED in that for the visible portion, and we put the near infrared. My argument being is that I believe that we should be able to put blue back. I think blue has been gotten a bum rap because the blue that I see in the sky as the sun is coming up here, Max, is that is a beautiful blue, and the same thing is true at sunset. You have blues all over the place, but the difference is that that blue is never exposed. We're not number one. It's broadband. Number two, majority of the energy coming into my eye when I look at that blue sky is actually in the near infrared. And I believe that that is what is basically allowing us for 100 years to live underneath a blue sky. Where we got into trouble and why I think we do need blue blockers is in our artificial environment where there is, LEDs emit zero near infrared, that are available today. So if you don't have it, then you essentially have to block it out, which I think is, it's kind of like making the kids all wear masks during COVID. They lost all their ability to understand facial expression. Why should I give up blue? I can go outside. I get tons of blue. Why should I give up my blue indoors? We had one lady that wanted to buy a lamp. She had a credit card. She had her blue blockers on. She couldn't read the number on the credit card because it was essentially blocking the reflectance of that blue whatever numbers that were on it. So my argument is that I think what we've gotten to is we have made light sources that you actually need to filter in order to be happy with them. And I think that's the mistake. And, and I understand they did it for all the great reasons of selling, reducing electricity usage. It's failed miserably because people put in more lights and light their houses more and all that other stuff at night than what they used to. So I would argue that, I guess I'm on the other side where I would say that, we need to put back what we took away. Once you put it back, then we can discuss how we can be smarter about convincing people. They don't have to go to incandescent. Incandescent is 10 lumens per watt. We do 50 to 60 lumens per watt. An LED at the high end does 120 lumens per watt. Is it worth giving up blue, giving up what I think causing problems for people where they need to use red light therapy simply because we're unwilling we want to go from 60 up to 120. And that's kind of the general argument I'm making. So, doesn't discount anything that Andrew said. He's 100% right, but there's this other component in there that I think needs to be put in. And once you put it in, I'm actually hoping that once we put the near infrared back in a level that is close to sunlight, which is anywhere from 1 to 3 to 1 in optical watts between visible and near infrared, then you can maybe think about bringing some UV in and bringing that back into the mix. The dermatologists are going to hate me, but the reality is that there's a lot of indications that the UV component is important as well. So, and we're blocking it all out. And I'd like to actually see Max without him seeing it all in red. That's what I'd like.
Right? Yeah, someday. He's trapped in this red quantum zone.
Yeah. So I'm a blue fan. I just don't think we're putting.
Well, you're a balanced blue fan, Scott. I think
Right.
to make that point really clear, you're a balanced blue fan, and that I think we need to be really specific. Otherwise, people will get confused. We're all united in our opposition of isolated narrowband artificial blue light, but blue in paired with red and infrared is the way that ancestrally we got it. So maybe that's a good point to wrap up the discussion on indoor lighting, which is after the sun goes down, my point is that we should have the least amount of light that we need to do what we need to do. Scott, you're saying that you can do that through dimming, which makes complete sense to me. But to me, we wouldn't have had a massive dose of near infrared after the sun's gone down. So the least amount of light, and that's our circadian needs as well, seems to be what we can what we barely need to see and not, fall over. But really, the body expects no light, and that includes no near infrared after dark.
Well, I mean, when you look at moonlight has a ton of near infrared. In fact, it actually shifts slightly into the near infrared because of the reflectance characteristics of the moon's surface. It's at orders of magnitude lower than what you've got in during the day, but there's a reason to call it a blue moon. And like I say, one of the things is that we keep on saying that we have to have this red at night for the circadian response. Well, how can I have all the blue around me when I look around at a sunset? It's mostly blue because we've got this hemisphere of the atmosphere that's scattering blue even into the sunset. So, and the sunset only lasts for 10, 15 minutes. So how can the red be the key element and blue be a bad thing? I'm not sure it is. I think I'll make this statement and people can get mad at me if they want, but I think that circadian and sleep disruption is more of a function of A, dimming range, but B, lack of the near infrared. I think if you put we fall asleep just fine outdoors under a blue night sky, as we do, we've kind of convinced ourselves that we need to be red. And I'm not 100% convinced that that's true. It's almost like circadian is a symptom of a more bigger problem. And if you put enough near infrared back in, I'm not so sure you're going to have a sleep disruption. It's like Andrew said about spending out of time outdoors all day. You kind of pump things up. You can get through it.
Pop up those numbers, yeah.
Yeah.
No, very,
Yeah,
very,
I think
very
that's
interesting.
key.
Very interesting points. I appreciate that. Let's maybe finish this episode on this where we started, which is this Make America Healthy Again movement. It via osmosis diffuses into places like Australia and the rest of the world. But I think I'm of the opinion, you're of the opinion that you both are of the opinion that light is a big part of this movement. So although at the moment it's talking predominantly about diet and food, how can we emphasize or raise the profile of the effect of light in this movement?
Yeah, I think, from my experience, I wanted to tackle my health and I got into diet. But you kind of start to feel like diet's not enough, so tackling all my health issues, I was like, well, I'm still sleeping very poorly. I still don't have a lot of energy in the middle of the day, and you start to hit a lot of big roadblocks that it seems like diet isn't going to fix. So I think, it's the doors opening towards, healthier food, healthier, lifestyles. I think people will just like you said, it's so synergistic with people are just going to naturally open their eyes and look around themselves, look at their sleep, look at their lighting environment, and, just start to be exposed to that. Oh, if I'm doing healthy swaps for food, maybe I can do healthy swaps for my lighting indoors, And so I think it's just pretty, it came to me pretty naturally of like, no one had to tell me. It just was, kind of like the elephant in the room of like, I gotta tackle my light environment and, utilize this light. And I've always felt more profound effects with, any kind of light therapy than, diet and lifestyle can do for me, and so I'm super sensitive to light, both good and bad. So, that was always my pathway.
I think the biggest problem I see is that lighting has become cheap, commoditized, and it's expanding. If you look at the space station data, we're increasing the background light, even with all the great work of the Dark Sky Group. I mean, it's great that they can go get some places where we can see the stars, but if you're in a modern society, urban area or rural area, even, it's hard to get away from light at night. It's just everywhere. And, coming in through your windows and all that. And I don't think that we really quantified how big an effect that is on the biology of the body. I mean, we need to get down to get to the point that people start turning switches off rather than even thinking about the dimming is one approach, but you know, child should be sleeping in the dark. Child should not be sleeping with a night light, especially one that's a blue LED night light, and even, I go to the trouble of taping over the AC to DC wall warts we use for our lamps because they had a little blue light indicator that I
Yeah,
can't get a lamp.
hate that.
So I use some tape to cover it up because I'm laying there in bed and I got all this nice low orange spike, and then there's this little annoying blue little light sitting over there that I pick up, and then it's kind of like, yeah, get rid of you. But I think that's really one of the fundamental problems is that people, the lighting is cheap. They put them out to highlight their house, and I'm concerned. All we're going to do is we're going to go and put in a bunch of red LEDs into some of these places or amber LEDs, and we're going to find oh, that's something else. The bats don't like that particular wavelength, or the slugs and the snails are being drug out from the whatever. It's every time we start deviating from the natural spectrum, we tend to set ourselves up for something else. And quite honestly, there's comfort involved. I like to watch a movie at night. I do. I watch it with an incandescent bulb or a RF bulb on at the same time. Don't know if it matters, but I at least convinced myself it did, you know. But like I say, every time we start to deviate, we start to find that there was something that the body was using that particular wavelength to do that we didn't really understand at the time. That's what I.
Yeah, well, this has been a very in-depth conversation, and I feel like we've opened, more questions, continually open more questions than we answered, but that's the fun of it, I think. So, yeah, thanks both of you for sharing your wisdom and your insights. Where can people buy your products and learn more about everything that you're doing?
Well, I mean, most of the write-ups I do is on LinkedIn, and then we are selling through our Naira Lighting. We're actually a small little company. We're growing. We're starting to now expand into Gen 2 thanks to Andrew and others. And we're starting to listen to the customer a little bit and build our ability to actually meet the demand. We've had been sold out a couple times because it's hard to get, to your point about hopefully things will change. I don't think that the government or even the Doge people quite understand yet how little there is of a supply chain for something like making a light bulb in the United States.
Yeah.
We're the closest thing when it comes to it, and it's very hard because I still have to buy parts from places overseas because
Yeah.
we threw away all that manufacturing capability. So I'm hopeful that they'll do something, but if they don't address the fundamental supply chain, where you get your capacitors, where you get everything else, they're kind of fooling everybody. They're kind of a joke. So.
Yeah.
There you
And
go.
I'm Andrew. I've got my website gembared.com. I'm on Instagram, YouTube, and then I've got my blog on the Gemba Red website. That's tons of educational, evidence-based research information there. So just search, for Gemba Red.
And thanks both of you for collaborating. And maybe I didn't make that clear enough at the beginning, but uh, Andrew, you tested some of Scott's bulbs for a range of parameters, including flicker. And Scott, you were, um, I guess, magnanimous enough to be open to feedback and to take Andrew's work and use it to help improve your bulbs. So I think that type of collaboration it's rare, but it's extremely valued and appreciated by us as consumers and by, I guess, the scientific community as we are all striving towards this more common goal of human friendly lighting. So yeah, thank
Yeah.
you both.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing, Andrew was nice enough to run the test for me. You know, small little companies like us have to help each other as much as we can. And I do believe that what he's doing, what we're doing, they're all complementary.
Mhm.
We've got a deficiency. We're trying to fill that gap. And for some people, it matters a lot, and for other people, it doesn't. And yeah, I think that there's no. I think they're both, like I say, complementary to each other. What's going on because we're learning the same stuff. Well,
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, but yeah, no, it's great to give someone feedback and not have them, bite your head off. So, that's pretty. It's very rare for me in this industry. Has been very interesting to see how people react because I just test stuff, I point stuff out, I criticize, and it's like, oh, I guess we don't do that in this industry. We just have to, you know, pretend like
it's kind of
nothing's wrong.
isn't it kind of shame that I mean having an open dialogue and people see that as something wrong with that. I mean, to me, it's like part of discovery. Oh well, here's what
Yeah,
I think. What do you
right.
think? I
But
disagree with you.
right.
You're wrong. I'm right. I don't care. Whatever.
Right. I've worked with, real, in engineering corporations and stuff. We go back and forth very harshly, but it's very rare. I've never heard anyone, try to recoil and use like kind of rhetorical arguments and say, oh, no, you're just attacking me. It's personal. Or I'm like, what are you talking? Like, I've never been in a professional situation where everything's so personal. And it's just, if you got a problem, we have to first acknowledge the problem exists, which is a big step, and then work together on the best solution. And there's going to be a lot of debate and back and forth, but so yeah, these kinds of discussions are really key. Having differing opinions is part of the process. And, I think a
Well,
lot of times the consumer starts to say, oh, well, it's confusing because Andrew said one thing and Scott said a different thing. And why can't everyone just tell me the same thing? Because then it'll, reinforce the same bias, so I get like really, if people want to follow me, I'm not going to reinforce your biases. It's just, very rarely happens. So,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
And I
yeah.
want to know for my Australian listeners, like when will either of you be shipping large volumes into Australia? Because I think we in Australia, although we're only 25 million people, we have a lot of informed and intelligent consumers, and we want some of your high quality product here.
I have no plans to ship outside of the US. I've tried before, and now, there's different regulations that I haven't even looked up for different countries. Every country has different electronics regulations, medical regulations, customs, shipping problems. So it just stacks up and, creates an unfavorable condition for me. So I try to stick to, USA and, anyone in the world can get free education from me, but my products are staying in the USA.
Yeah, he's probably
Fair enough.
smarter than we. We try. I put the money and time into doing a 230-volt
Right.
version of the design, and then I came to the conclusion: okay, if I ship this to England, they're probably going to come and arrest me and put me and fine me
Right.
trying to sell a
Because then you
product.
got to spend $10,000 for a CE mark, or something like that. One of those because
Yeah,
there's different regulations.
yeah, I think again, I believe that that's why they should probably shut down some of these government agencies that are setting some of these mandates because Andrew, as Andrew said right before, we're in the middle of a discovery phase. We're
Yeah.
trying to figure all this stuff out. You coming in and putting a sledgehammer up to my head, and saying you can't do work over here. I have to work over here. This doesn't work, guys. This is what's causing your problem. You need to go move over here and do something different. And, that's really the problem. I mean, if you can guarantee me I can ship you some product and not get in trouble or get fined from Australia, I'll be happy to ship you some product, you
Right.
know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not technically, there's no technical reason I can't ship you a product that you can plug into your wall or screw into your screw socket you've got. I just don't know that I can do it without getting fined for it,
Yeah.
And so
The
I don't know how you
bureaucracy.
get those people to change.
Yeah. It can be suffocating at times.
So maybe we'll call it something else. We're going to call it I don't know, an ear warmer, or I don't know what you want to call it.
Right. Yeah.
Alrighty. Well, gentlemen, thanks again, and yeah, we'll definitely be talking again soon. So appreciate you both.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.